But I love these stories so much, and they don't make for good sermons. But I just love these stories so much. So I thought, well, let's just talk about this story, and it connects to another story, and it connects to other stuff. So we'll just sort of follow and see where this goes. The problem with doing a sermon from the book of Ruth is that the book of Ruth is extremely complicated. And it's complicated because the culture that it comes out of is so different from our own culture that you sort of have to take like an advanced course in sociology before you can make sense out of Ruth. And we don't have time for an advanced course in sociology this morning. And it's complicated by the fact that there's a whole lot of questions in the book of Ruth that we simply don't know the answer to. There is simply no way of knowing like when this book was written and who wrote it and who it was written for and like which century it was written in. We have no idea. Like within 10 centuries. Probably 6. I could probably give you an estimate within 6 centuries of when it was written, and most scholars would go, yeah, probably somewhere in those 6 centuries it was written. But it's sort of that, there's just that level of what we don't know here. But there are things we do know. So the story is all about this woman whose name is Ruth, and there's sort of a lot of complicating factors. Right? So in some ways this is a story about inheritance. It's about the inheritance of land, and it assumes that you understand how land ownership works in Israel, which is quite different than how land ownership works today. So there's a long, complicated story in the background. Right? It's also about foreigners, because Ruth is a Moabite. She's a foreign woman. And the law says that no foreign woman, the children of a foreign woman can't become true Israelites for 10 generations. Which gets complicated because ends up that her grandchild is David the king. So they're not even following their own rules. Right? And it's a story about how land gets passed on and how laws get passed on and just sort of all sorts of complicated factors. And so one of the questions that arises in this story when scholars sit around and write papers about it is, where did these rules come from? Because the book of Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy is all full of rules. Right? And so we read in Deuteronomy part of the rules of inheritance for how land gets inherited in Israel and how women get inherited in Israel and how names get passed on and all of these sorts of things which are all tied together. Because the assumption in Israel is that any man who doesn't own land isn't a real person. Right? Because, how could you be without owning land, and what would you eat? Because it's an entirely agricultural economy, right? So this is all very complicated. So Boaz, this is just so much fun. We don't even know exactly what Boaz wants here. But clearly one of the things he wants is Ruth. Right? That at the end of it, the thing he's most proud of is that I'm getting Ruth. Right? Even though she's this foreign woman whom he's clearly not supposed to have. And it's like a really bad thing, but he wants her anyway. But it's not that simple, because it just isn't. Right? So he sits down, and in those days, in the village context, the villagers get together, and there's the elders, and they sort of sit at the gate of the village. At the entrance to the village, there's probably a little bit of a wall around the village to keep out the bears and the wolves and things like that, to keep the sheep in, and the chickens and stuff like that, right? And so the elders are sitting at the gate just hanging out, because that's what old men do, right? They just sort of sit at the gate and they hang out all day, and then they go home and eat supper and go to bed, and the next day they go and hang out, right? Because they didn't have coffee shops in those days. So old men have to do something. So they're sitting around there, and they're the deciders in a lot of ways. And so Boaz calls together a group of them and says, we got to make a decision, and some guy comes by, right? And so there's a man whose job it is really to take care of Naomi and mostly take care of her mom. Right? Naomi is the mom and Ruth is the daughter. And he's supposed to be taking care of them. He's not doing his job, and Boaz is trying to pressure him. He's trying to talk him out of buying this land. Like I said, this is complicated. So then Boaz says to this dude, you have the right, you have the first right of refusal on this land that is being sold. And he goes, well, I'll gladly buy the land, because I want more land. For whatever reason, he wants this piece of land. And then Boaz says, well, the moment you buy this land, you also get this woman who comes along with the land. And scholars look at this and go, where does it say that? It's not in Deuteronomy, it's not in Numbers, it's not in Leviticus, and it's not in Exodus or Genesis, or it's just not there. And so they've puzzled about this and tried to find various textual places where sort of hints of this rule is. So a few years ago, I was teaching a course on the book of Ruth in Ghana. And one of the things that scholars have noted, especially African scholars have noted for years, is that traditional African cultures are very, very, very much like biblical culture. So that they read this stuff and they just get it in ways that you and I don't. They read this stuff, and the Old Testament comes from a tribal society, and many people in Ghana, everybody in Ghana lives in a tribal society. And this stuff comes from an agricultural society, and Ghana is still mostly an agricultural society. And so there's just so many parallels between the two societies that, I had students who just their favorite book of the Bible, Leviticus. That was just the most interesting and the most relevant book in the Bible to their lives. They just got this stuff in ways and so this was a regular part of class was I would try to explain stuff to them and then they'd explain it back to me. And this happened when I was doing Ruth here. I was trying to explain to them the intricacies and the big question of so where does this law come from? And one of my students looked at me and goes, this stuff happens all the time in my village. This doesn't, I know how this works. And I said, well, then explain this to me. And he said, well, what happens is that Boaz is a big man. Right? That's the Ghanaian term for this. But yeah, like Judges or Ruth chapter 2. Right? Boaz is a prominent rich man. Right? Not a good translation. Really, it's a big man, is what a literal translation would be. So the Ghanaians, they understood big man. And this is an oral culture. And in an oral culture, the law does not exist in a book. The law exists in the minds of the people. It's oral. It's not written down anywhere. Right? The nation of Ghana has its national laws that are written down and codified just like our laws are, because they got their system from the British, just like we did. But tribal law doesn't exist anywhere as a book. It exists in the minds of the people who remember it. And one of the things that means is that if you're a big man and you have authority and you have some social capital to spend, you can make the law say anything you want it to. As long as you can convince the elders to go along with you and the people, right? There's Boaz and this other dude. There's the elders sitting there, and then there's all the people watching. And they all have some say in what the law is. Right? Boaz isn't free just to totally make up something entirely contrary to everything everyone has been doing till now. Right? He has sort of a certain amount of authority as a big man, but he's not a dictator. Right? He is entirely dependent in some significant ways on the consent of his community. But he does that. He says, on the day you acquire the land, you also acquire Ruth. And this is a law because he says so. And because everybody else in that community goes, okay. and therefore it is a law. In Ghana, it's even more complicated than that, because the laws not only don't exist on paper, but they don't exist as rules in the tribes. They exist as sayings. Anytime you're in any situation in Ghana, somebody will say, oh yeah, we have a saying for that. And Ghanaian sayings make no sense. There's no obvious, like people would give me these, 4 ducks do not equal a camel. What does that mean? And what it means depends on who it is that's telling you what it means. There's nothing stable about the meaning of a saying in Ghana. It's like in this situation, it could mean this, and in that situation, it could mean that. I was just, because I read the book of Proverbs, and I go, well, these are all sort of pretty straightforward kinds of things. Do good, good things happen to you, do bad, doesn't work. That's pretty much the whole book of Proverbs right there. But Ghanaian sayings, right, really complicated. But, right, and so the interpretation depends on who can convince the most number of people that their way of understanding the situation makes the most sense. But also, what does the big man say at the end of the day? So we as a congregation are at the beginnings of a process of trying to create some sort of connection with Good News Seminary in Ghana. And we do this in sort of fits and starts, and part of it is we send them some money once in a while because it's just tricky running a seminary. Well, the truth is that virtually every seminary in the world right now is on the edge of bankruptcy. It really doesn't matter which part of the world you're in or which denomination you're in. Most of them are just sort of hanging on. So the fact that it's also true in Ghana should not surprise anybody, anywhere. And so we're trying to, right, but also, right, the hope is that we're just not sort of throwing money at them, but that somehow over time we're going to create a relationship that's mutually beneficial. And part of the reason that this is a great thing is because the heart of Christianity, the sort of the core of it, is or has already moved. And that in 50, 100 years ago, the heart of Christianity was Europe, North America. Those were the people who dictated what the church was supposed to be. And that's no longer true. That Europe and North America is still in some ways where most of the cash is, for really complicated reasons, not at all straightforward. But the people are in Africa and South America. Right? If you want to see a church that's growing, Morgantown is not the place to be. Right? There might be a church or two in Morgantown that's growing, but there's also like this one, right? But also a few hundred that are shrinking, or at least a few dozen that are shrinking. Right? And in Ghana, and in many places in Africa and in South America and in East Asia, right, the church is expanding rapidly. And so, right, part of the reason that we are trying to develop this relationship, right, is to be part of that. Is to be part of this movement of God, especially in a time when we look around here and we go, wow, it looks like God has sort of moved south on us. And we're this many people and we're not thinking of planting a new church yet. Whereas in Ghana, if we had this many people and our walls were already up, well, we've got to plant a new church. And so to catch some of that, and just to catch the joy. We won't ever get to be a great dancing church, but hopefully some part of the joy and the spirit of the church in Ghana, in so many parts of the world, is something we can catch, appreciate, and in some ways be part of. I think that's also, right, part of what, for me, is the joy of the communion time. is to know that there are people all over the world participating in the bread and the wine, or not, right? Because some churches do it every Sunday, and some churches do it every month, and some churches do it once a year. And that's true in Ghana as well, and they have arguments. And I spent a fair bit of time in seminary arguing with them about communion. Not arguing, because Ghanaians don't argue, they discuss and then they laugh. So we laughed about communion, because they had inherited a really formal Western communion that makes no sense to me in Ghanaian culture, but does to them. So who am I? But it's not biblical either. You know, like the way we do, there's nothing in the Bible about taking little cups and, you know, all the formality of what we do. And the New Testament thinks about communion as a meal. That our picnic looks a lot more like biblical communion than this does, if we're going to be strictly biblical about it all. Right? But Ghanaians, they would go, this is really too plain. You got to have, you know, special cloth covering all of this, and you know. So I invite you this morning to come and participate in communion. And many of you have traveled other places in the world, or other places in West Virginia, that look very different than this gathering. Right? And just try to imaginatively participate in communion in Korea, right? Or communion, right, in wherever you've been, or maybe just a place you've read about. You know, if you've read about some place, you know, like, what is communion like in Iran? Have you been to communion in Iran? Okay, so you don't even know either.
I have.
You have been to communion in Iran. Okay.
A long time ago.
A long time ago. Right? So I invite you to the table this morning. And just to take some time and let me grab these things. And imagine what this might look like somewhere else. And so we're going to, this morning, just as we imaginatively, in some ways, participate in the body and the blood of Jesus, we can also imaginatively participate in communion in some other part of the world. Right? And so I'm going to be back in Ghana. And not really, because this is just all wrong. For Ghana, they would just shake their head and go, oh, that's right. And I'd have to say a lot about blood, because in Ghana they understand about blood, and we don't do blood in the same way here, because most of you don't have to butcher your own meat before you eat it, so it changes your attitude. So I invite you to come forward this morning.